wellnesscouch.com, streaming wellness into your lives.
You're listening to A Quirky Journey, the healthy family podcast with your hosts Jo Whitten and Fouad Kassab. Welcome to A Quirky Journey. Join us as we share our family's journeys to good health. You'll find plenty of inspiration, tips and recipe ideas, as well as stories from everyday people who've struggled and overcome health problems and diet challenges in their own families. I'm Jo Whitten, author of the blog and book Quirky Cooking, and I have my co-host Fouad with me. Hi Fouad.
Hi Jo, how are you doing?
And I'm doing good. And we also have with us today Dr. T. So Igor is a doctor of, do I say biomedical doctor?
That's a good enough translation. Yes. Okay.
And he's going to explain to us a lot about inflammation, which is something he's written on. And but before we start, we thought we'd just get him to tell his story because he has a very interesting practice, and I've heard some really good things about him from people who've been to your talks, Igor, and have felt that you explain things really well. So I'm hoping that you can answer some of our questions today. But first of all, could you just give us a little bit of a background of who you are, what you do, what's your background with health, which direction you're coming from, and we'll just ask you all our questions. Thank you.
I'll try not to break into any silly accents.
Okay, that'll be great. We get enough of that from Fouad.
The occasional one. It's acceptable.
Okay, we'll throw it in randomly.
Yeah, we're pretty mad
it's
around
hard to know. I guess now, I suppose, I'm a GP with special interests.
Okay.
And that's in nutritional medicine, which is, I suppose it's a very broad area that began way back in the 60s where people were doing what they called orthomolecular medicine. Yeah. There were some issues with that because it just looks like they were prescribing, truckloads of vitamins without any particular reason. And so when I started to look at this area as in like, what can I learn from it? What can I teach other people from it? I thought there were some issues with it, that it didn't connect with my undergraduate learning, for instance, in biochemistry. So I had to rewrite what had been written or summarize what had been written. And because a lot of these, I suppose, threads like vitamin C, selenium, gluten, all these things are like threads in a tapestry. And it was sort of like it stopped in the 70s. No one kept writing about it. But a lot had been amassed up until that point. And I guess my textbook was an attempt to try to summarize everything in a biochemical flavor. So having said that, what I did was when I came back from my stint in Karratha as a GP anaesthetist, I realized that there was some problems with the medicine that I'd been taught as an undergraduate. I suspected it for a long time anyway, but I think I was more assured of it. So
what was it that you saw that caused that kind of doubt?
Well, giving anesthetics for starters, and I gave 10,500 anesthetics in the time that I was giving that, and you see things that you can't explain necessarily from your teaching. And then working in intensive care units, the same thing. There are stuff that in the real world, even stuff like acid-base balance, which is very cut and dried in medicine, and how the body balances acid and base. You see fractures in the information, and people write what is convenient to them at the time, and they leave out the exceptions. And I don't think that we should. So I guess after all this time working in this medicine, after straight stuff like, general medicine in major teaching hospitals here and overseas and anesthetics, I thought I'd better change it, even if it was just me and a few other people. So it was a drive to it. And I think when I look back, I was trying to think when I started to get, disgruntled. I think, first of all, I went to 12 different schools in 4 different states. So wow. I had to self-school myself because there was no consistency in the teaching. So I was always a bit what's the word, jaded with structured learning systems, especially tertiary ones. So I basically was a devout skeptic most of my life and didn't really believe what my teachers were telling me. I had a healthy skepticism and I had sort of an overview of things, and I guess the exceptions stuck in my mind. Perhaps I'm perverse, but I was always looking for the exceptions to the rule. And I think it started when I had glandular fever in year 12, actually, because I'd moved out of home. I was 16. I got really sick in the middle of the year, and I had a sore throat, night sweats for 3 months. I was really a mess. And I had post-viral fatigue for 7 years after that.
Wow.
I finished medical school, but it was a bit of a struggle.
I bet.
And all the time in my mind, I remember my sister, years later, had the same thing, and she had her glandular fever lasted for 2 weeks. And it stuck in my mind. Now, 2 people get the same virus, and one of them's over it in a couple of days. The other one goes on for 2 weeks or longer. What is the difference between these 2 people? And I guess that, looking back, I think that, I don't know, uncertainty about, because I couldn't get an explanation from anyone. They all thought I had some type of lymphoma or leukemia, and they just couldn't prove it. But it was post-viral fatigue or chronic fatigue syndrome. And then when I started in medical school, because I have a photographic and audio memory, I remember things and I can relate them pretty quickly. And I remember examples like 2 people have the same type of whiplash, same type of deceleration, soft tissue injury. You do an X-ray, they look exactly the same. You send them off for review, and one of them would be fine. 2 weeks later, hot weak pillow, couple of Panadol, fine. The other one, 4 years later, depression, anxiety, chronic pain, still arguing with the insurance commission about payout.
Wow.
Or 2 people would fall at work, hurt their back. One of them would be fine, physio, a bit of Nurofen, 6 weeks, that's okay. The other one, chronic pain, pain clinic, epidural, root sleeve injection, spinal fusion. And I was thinking, what is the difference between these 2 groups? And that bugged me for years and years and years. I still couldn't find an explanation for that until somewhat later, as in the last few years, when I was trying to explain the differences, because I seem to get the second group of people. and some of those groups, they also had these autoimmune disorders too, like Hashimoto's disease and lupus and ulcerative colitis. And I seem to get a whole rash of these patients all coming for answers. And I guess they come for 2 reasons. One is, why did I get this and not my sister or my neighbor or whatever? And what can I do about it? Or if it's already gone too far, what can I do for my children with it? And this is parallel to all the things that I'd been doing with autism, because I'd mostly seen cancer and chronic fatigue patients when I started doing this nutritional medicine. And that's an interesting story as well. I was giving a talk on the Gold Coast to the ACNUM people, the Australian College of Nutritional and Environmental Medicine, on xenoestrogens, these environmental hormones, which has led to things like the food grade plastics that we have, like the Thermomix, or changed that, IKEA, Tupperware, all these companies changed. And this lady came up to me afterwards. She said, look, I'm not a doctor or a naturopath. She said, I'm just a grandmother. But my 2 grandchildren have autism. Have you ever thought of looking at autism? And I said, actually, I have no idea what autism is. Can you tell me a bit more about it? And she said, I go to all these conferences in the US. And I've got all these DVDs and VCRs. That's how long ago it was. And I'll send you some information, like I'm thinking, a pamphlet, this. And then 2 weeks later, this box arrives just full of these conference notes and VCRs. And I was watching this and I was looking at it, and they have a very biochemical view. These conferences try to be as scientific as possible, given that subject is pretty well in the X-Files of medicine. And I was watching these videos, and I was looking at the biochemistry and the immunology and all these things that they were describing, and I thought, this looks exactly the same as the patients with chronic fatigue syndrome and cancer. They have the same issues. But the thing about these people, these kids, is they're born with their problem. They don't acquire it like the other two things, but it seemed very familiar. And that also, I suppose, rang alarm bells that maybe there was, when I look at these patients, there's some pattern, a hidden pattern or a common element to them all. Every single person who turns up with some chronic illness has something in common with the previous person and the next person. And I guess I've always been a bit of a detective, and that's where this book on inflammation came through, because when I started to relook at the research, migraine, autism, bipolar, asthma, eczema, ulcerative colitis, arthritis, they all have a similar immunological issue. And that is that there's inflammation in all of them. So all these things that have happened to me and my observations that were bugging me eventually led me to find some sort of solution. And I couldn't find it in the textbooks, and I couldn't necessarily find it in the literature, but I found it in two very strange places. And the first one was the gene studies that I started to do with a company called Fit Genes, which was actually based in Queensland. Okay. And their test shows the propensity for inflammation genetically in a sort of a semi-quantitative way for so many different types of genes, or the genes that activate the inflammation. And it seemed like there were two basic patterns in that. There was one group of patients whose immune system would do a nice short job, and that's it. And they were the people who had the 2-day cold, the 2-week improvement after whiplash, the 6-week improvement after a fall on hard surface at work. They were the people whose immune systems would do things quickly. And then the other group were those whose immune systems just didn't want to stop. Once you pushed its buttons, it just seemed to go on and on and on. And I thought, well, there must be something else going on here, because in parallel to this, I started doing, poo samples, looking at the different bacteria in the gut, the pH, who's there, who's not, parasites, whether the person is digesting the food properly, all these sorts of things, these comprehensive stool digestive analyses. And I distinctly remember one time the patient who had one of these autoimmune disorders, and we got a result back showing that they had a high amount of Klebsiella in their species, Klebsiella pneumonia. And the comment from the microbiologist about it was, this bug is notorious for instigating pro-inflammatory states, and it's worse if you have a genetic predisposition like a gene called HLA-B27. And I thought, you bastards, how long have you known this? These organisms set off this response, and you've not told us? Like, we're the ones dealing with these people coming in. They're asking questions like, how come I got this arthritis 3 months after I got this bad gastro?
So we're not screening people for this. That's because we have to sort of wait until there's a real reason for us to check these, and then look genetically. And so it stops a lot of progress in people because they're not looking in the right place. Is that
medicine is reactive?
Right. Okay.
We're waiting for disease, and there's only two outcomes. Either we don't have a treatment for it that we've heard of, or one day there might be, But it's not about, doctors aren't taught about causation of disease. It's a misnomer to think that they are mechanics that fix cars, because mechanics know how spark plugs work, and engine management systems, and fuel lines, and thermostats, and fans, and this kind of thing. But doctors don't really. The amount of teaching in terms of the anatomy and physiology and biochem is getting less and less, actually.
Wow, that's scary.
So there was these samples coming in, and there were other bugs as well. It wasn't just that one. And I remember looking after patients who had this condition called Guillain-Barré syndrome, where they become paralyzed from the feet and upwards. And we used to have to put them on a ventilator because, as anaesthetist, that was the only thing you could do. And the number of those patients whose relatives at least asked, why did this happen? Because that's supposedly related to exposure to Campylobacter jejuni, which is the commonest cause of food poisoning in this country.
Okay.
And so why is it that one person gets this? Or, 100 people go into a museum that has Legionella in the cooling towers of the aircon, and only 5 of them get Legionnaire's disease.
Yeah.
Those sorts of questions were always in the back of my mind. So I thought, well, it seems that there's an interaction somehow between the bacteria that attacks you or the virus that attacks you. So there's a bug that meets the genome of the host, and it's either a happy ending or resolved at least. So you get streptococcus, you fight it over a few days, and then it's gone. It doesn't bug you. Your immune system doesn't play up for years afterwards. But for some people, they meet a particular streptococcus, they have a sore throat, strep throat, and then they'll get kidney failure.
Wow.
You see? So the genetics partly explains their tendency to overreact to these particular stimuli, or what's the word, infractions. I mean, we have bugs that live in our gut.
Yeah.
If you took out all the bacteria that lived in your intestine, it would weigh about 700 grams.
Wow.
And the first person who analysed it found 350 different species of organisms. And they all have to get on.
Yeah.
Now the number's more like 800 to 900, but the diversity in general is lower than, say, 50 years ago. This is what the American poo sample studies have been showing.
Wow.
And so looking at the people who had dysbiosis, they definitely had lots more inflammation, apart from the obvious ones in the intestine.
So just to clarify to our listeners, dysbiosis is the state where the types of bacteria and the quantities of them are not in a correct, healthy balance. Is that
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah, okay.
I'll give you an example. We did find quite a lot of children with behavioural issues, including things like Tourette's, who had very low E. coli in their intestine, like 0 levels, very high levels of streptococcus. And streptococci can either just be a nuisance and annoying because their pet hobby is to make lactic acid, which affects your gut, makes you constipated, sore abdomen, almost to the point where it looks like appendicitis, affects your brain function, liver function, muscles. It can just be annoying, or it can be associated with a disease called pandis, which is about an autoimmune brain reaction to the strep. So trying to analyse, well, why are their E. coli so low? A lot of these kids were Caesar babies, so C-sections.
Yep.
And what people don't realise of a C-section is, as the anaesthetist, as soon as the cord is clamped, we give the mother a shot of a high, fourth-generation cephalosporin antibiotic, a broad-spectrum antibiotic, which doesn't go directly into the baby, but it comes down in her breast milk for the next few days.
Yeah.
So not only did she not get the flora from the vaginal canal, she's excreting these broad-spectrum antibiotics into the baby's stomach. But the E. coli.
Babies, sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but with a very interesting point there, like with the, from what I've heard is that when the baby is born, their stomach is sterile and it is populated by the birth through the vaginal canal. Is that correct? Okay,
yeah.
So when they have the antibiotics,
they go through.
So let's say they've gone through C-section and the mother's been given the antibiotics. Where would they have actually populated that flora from? Anyway, where would that come from?
They don't have it.
Okay,
and moreover, they have antibiotics to kill off whatever might be starting to grow.
And over the next 5-6 months, where would the bacteria be coming from to populate the gut?
Comes through from the mother's nipple.
Okay, right.
And then eventually from solids, depending on what sort of diet they're on.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's the importance of breast milk.
C-section babies have, I don't know, 60 times the rate of allergy in this country.
Wow.
So the coming back to the bacteria in the gut have some strong influence over how the immune system reacts or not reacts. And I remember my first patient came back, all her eczema had cleared up. And I said, "Oh, how did you do that?" She said, "Oh, my dermatologist put me on this product called Eczema Shield. because he believes that the inflammation in the skin is strongly influenced by the gut bacteria.
Oh, that's good.
Well, they convinced the TGA also that this is the case, and that's how they're able to call it eczema shield. So all these things coming. Anyway, so coming back to why the E. coli is low, it turns out that there are several reasons why the E. coli are low. The first one is that anything that you take to lower a fever will kill them off. Okay, that's anything you give a child to lower a fever, perhaps except a homeopathic form of fever control.
They don't tell you that about Panadol, do they?
No, they don't.
So what does it do? What does the Panadol do?
It kills the E. coli. The E. coli, there are two types of bugs that live in the intestine in general. They're the ones that like oxygen. They're the aerobic ones. Mm-hmm. And the majority of those are actually the E. coli bugs. Now everyone's E. coli is a much maligned bacteria, but most of them are actually good guys. There's a few rotten eggs in there, a bit like financial planners and lawyers, but in general, they are good guys. They have good hearts, because what they do is that they're a bit like online caterers. The deal is that they can live there as long as they supply us with something or do some sort of job. So their job might be to help digest things for us. And in fact, E. coli are very handy at digesting things. We actually use them in metallurgy to help digest gold ores, because they like the sulfur. So the problem with gold in sort of micro nano amounts, is that it's all surrounded by sulfur, and it's a real pain in the butt to try to get it out. So you put your friendly E. coli in there, and they will digest it.
Wow.
So the other thing, so the E. coli are low, and what we found was that many of these kids had behavioural sleep disorders because the E. coli were helping to make brain neurotransmitter precursors, amino acids, that are converted to things like serotonin, melatonin, noradrenaline and dopamine. And they do quite a good job of that. They make some B vitamins for us. They make coenzyme Q10. And as the numbers dwindle, there's a problem. And one of the problems is that another aerobe will take over. And so the straps, which are the nemesis of these E. coli, they live in the mouth. They live there all the time, and they live in the back of the throat, hence strep throat. And so when you swallow them, normally they shouldn't take hold and get a foothold, but if the E. coli aren't there to hold the fort, then the strips start to overrun the place. So these poo samples were quite useful in terms of understanding behaviour, understanding pain levels, and then I started to do them on the adults, and that's when I realised that the gut bacteria dysbiosis issue actually is starting quite early in these kids. And for years and years, and I was a medical student, Fiona Stanley has been screaming, why are children getting adult diseases today? And I started to realise these patterns. I remember seeing this 3-year-old kid, and I said to the mum, this kid's full of inflammation. And she said, that doesn't surprise me because I've got fibromyalgia and my mother has rheumatoid arthritis. So there's the genetics to be inflamed, expressed in 3 different ways. And the difference was that the child's gut wasn't as good as the mother's, it wasn't as good as the grandmother's. And that's been shown that the type of bacteria, and this is related to what we've been eating. And there's one really other horrible reason why the E. coli might be dead, and that's because the fertilizers that we use, the herbicides, kill them off. And there's actually, I can show you some studies to show that, and this is one of the best reasons for buying organic and biodynamic produce, because at least you're not killing off the good bacteria that you're trying to promote with your good food. So there's all these reasons why the E. coli levels were low, why we saw behavioural issues, learning disorders, sleep disorders, chronic anxiety, that all came from an imbalance in the intestine. But further on, as I started to do in adults, I started to see that something had to trigger their chronic illness. it's this bug versus genome or bug meets genome scenario. And the bad outcome is if you meet the wrong bug and you've got the pro-inflammatory gene set and you had low levels of key nutrients like zinc and iodine, manganese, copper, selenium, you've got almost 100% chance of getting an autoimmune disorder eventually from that one meeting. And that's what the book tries to summarize, to show, why is it? What are the factors that send people down that pathway? There was something genetic, something nutritional about them, and then some trigger that set it all off. So that's where it came from, I suppose, all those bits and pieces, and the universe throws you clues and codes, and we have to try and put
it all together. So would you, do you explain in your book, for people that are feeling like they may be heading down this track, they're heading towards autoimmune disorders and things.
Find out what your liabilities are.
Yeah.
I do. Right at the very end is like a self-help page. I'll just skip to it and I'll just read out what it shows you. Because I give people, this is an interesting exercise doing the ebook, because normally when you do references, you do a footnote, you can put it at the bottom or you can do it at the end. But with the ebook, you can do it on the line that you've just said, vitamin D is an antibiotic, because people go, what the, where did he get that from? And you can click on a link and it takes you straight to pub and shows you, yes, there's a summary article of all the articles that show that vitamin D is antibiotic effect.
Wow.
And that, I think, makes it's both interesting and scary. But so the book is written in that way, because you can't do that with print. You've got to go look it up and we'll put the reference in there. But the checklist for things that I'll read them out. Do I have any autoimmune markers? And there are some. There's enough available, from blood tests in Australia, you can at least get a handle for it. We don't have a full set. Some of them are research tools, but the major ones are there. Are there any right now? A lot of doctors dismiss them when they're very low levels because they can't explain them. It's because those people are still under the radar.
Yep.
They haven't moved on to I suppose, a clinical situation, and that's the thing about being a doctor. You wait for illness to come and then you do something.
So they basically need to get a blood test to find.
Yeah.
Okay.
In the book, I asked, find a doctor who's sympathetic and doesn't mind investigating. I think a doctor's a bit paranoid. Yeah. Medicare has a lot to answer for in this country because they persecute doctors who do things out of the norm. They certainly don't encourage. If we were to prevent the illnesses by measuring these things early enough, we might actually save them a hell of a lot of money.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, the next thing is, do I have pro-inflammatory genetics? And there are different companies that do this. There's 23andMe, there's Smart DNA, there's the Fit Genes. The problem with those is that, there are 30,000 human genes, so you've got to pick a few to do a report on, and your focus will be what you think is the demographics of the people asking for the test. If they're all got inflammation, then you're going to put that on page 1 of your report. And this is the good thing about the Fit Genes, is that it does summarize and collate those genes in one spot. It's the first page, and I've just found it so useful. And you can sort of gauge what your propensity to inflammation is, and it's quite easy to read that. But the practitioners who do it are quite well trained. They're actually very good at interpreting those things for you. And the best part about it is that for each of the issues, there's some sort of intervention. You don't just sit there and go, "Oh, I got bad genes, I can't do anything about it." That's not true at all. There are lots of things you can do.
Oh, that's good.
And that's the other thing. Since the human genome was mapped, we started to understand that there's more to it than just the DNA code. There's there's epigenetics, there's the codons, there's genes that repair other genes. There's a whole lot of stuff that isn't apparent just by looking at the genome. Then the next question is, what are the state of my fire extinguishers? And we all have some inflammation in the body. It's like a pilot light and a gas hot water heater. You just can't run the heater without the pilot light being on all the time. But what you want is to be able to switch it off if it goes too hot. And we all have these fire extinguishers within the cells that work to limit inflammation so that it doesn't burn the cell up. And you can get an idea of that from various things. The gene test tells you how good you are at making some of these fire extinguishers. There's two in particular. There's one called SODMN, which is manganese superoxide dismutase. And some people are really good at making this fire extinguisher, and some people are really crappy at making it. And the other one that's probably more known to your readers would be glutathione, because that really turns up in a lot of things from autism, ADD, cancer, chronic fatigue. And the gene test tells you whether you're good at making glutathione. But to make those two, to actually put them together as an ingredient, you actually need selenium and manganese, which you can find out by doing a hair sample. So the fire extinguishers, that whole question is, am I good at making fire extinguishers? And if I was bad at it, I would move hell and high water to make sure I had all the ingredients there to make it. Because if they're low, then I'm even in bigger trouble.
So you're saying you'd need to supplement with the...
It depends. It depends on what your issues are. If you're talking about this superoxide dismutase, if you're manganese deficient, and 85% of my patients were, one of the reasons I had a visit from Medicare because they were wondering why I was measuring these things. And when I showed them the results, that 85% of the manganeses came back deficient, they said, wow, that's really quite substantial that you've found this problem. And like 35% of the chromiums came back deficient, as in zero, none at all in the bloodstream, not one atom detectable. So they couldn't really say much about that because I was trying to correct it, because there were really important reasons to correct those deficiencies. But when I look back and I think, oh my God, these people with low manganese, what if they were really crappy at making superoxide dismutase? They would not have any chance of putting out a fire in their cell. That would be doubly...
Shot shock, basically.
So the state of the fire extinguishers is sort of a combination of two things, your genetics of it and whether you have the base ingredients to make it. And that's where the next question is, how are my nutrient toxin levels? And it's like iodine, for instance, is a moot point in this country. The Food Standards Australia and New Zealand clearly say on their website that everyone in Australia and New Zealand is going to be low in iodine. Wow. It's the only government body that actually admits that. And we know that they aren't always the best people to admit things. So
why is it that
it's really important?
Why is it that we're so low?
It's because the topsoil in most of Australia has been underwater and it leached out of the topsoil. And we've got lots of nutrients underground. Like if you're looking at zinc, for instance, most of the agricultural departments around the place will say that zinc deficiency is a significant issue for farmers. And yet we have the biggest zinc mine in the world. It's called Century Mine because you could mine it for zinc for a whole century and never run out of zinc.
But it's too far down for growing in.
Well, what's underground isn't, it's not useful for topsoil plants. So, and we're eating off the topsoil, if you know what I mean. So the nutrient levels and toxin levels, and the other thing that I found when I was looking at nutrient levels is metals like mercury and aluminium and antimony and cadmium, lead have a blocking effect on many of the minerals. So if mercury is in the same cell as zinc, it will look like it's blocking 1,000 zinc atoms. But one mercury atom blocks 1,000 zinc atoms. And for cadmium, it's 100 to 1. And that's not that well known because we often dismiss what we think are subclinical levels of mercury and other heavy metals. But if they're in the wrong place, like if you've got mercury in your brain, the best fire extinguisher is probably glutathione. So if you're selenium deficient, you won't make it. And if you're genetically crappy at making glutathione, the mercury is going to have a heyday.
And what will that do?
That's one of the fundamental, I suppose, issues in children with autism.
Okay.
That the genetic side of it is that they may not be able to make fire extinguishers, because heaps of children have mercury in their body. Heaps of them. Almost everyone I see has got mercury, but not all of them have autism.
Yeah.
So these toxins and nutrients have an interplay between them. And the other thing that we noticed is that if two people are exposed to the same toxin, the one with the low nutrients will absorb more of them. And it's because mercury, for instance, has no place in the body naturally. So it'll just sit in somebody's parking spot. And one of the parking spots that it likes to sit in is iodine. If you're iodine deficient, you're going to take up more mercury from the environment than another person. This is very important for fish because if you have fish in temperate waters, they don't have a lot of iodine compared to cold waters like the Arctic and the Atlantic.
Okay.
So if they're near oil rigs, then they're going to take up more mercury out of the ocean water than a fish that has lots of iodine in it, and we're the same. So because we see, I do quite a lot of pregnant women and women who are breastfeeding, I know the levels of these things are low. So the baby's going to be a mirror image of that.
Yeah.
They get exposed to mercury, there are more parking spots for it. And if they have problems making glutathione and superoxide dismutase, they're going to suffer more. That's called oxidative stress.
Yeah.
So and the last one is, what markers of inflammation do I have? And we've got about 5 or 6 ones that you could do that would be routine tests for that. The full blood picture that doctors do looking for anemia has another part to it called the ESR, the erythrocyte sedimentation rate. That's one of the markers of inflammation if it's up. There's another one called CRP, C-reactive protein. That's available as a almost routine test. The platelet count, which is done on the full blood picture, the white cell count, the ferritin, which is one of the indirect markers of iron, and fibrinogen. Those sorts of tests, any GP can order them. So between the blood tests, the gene samples, and say a hair analysis, a person would get a very good view of what they'd either be able to understand why they have their inflammation, whatever that itis is, whether it be sinusitis or arthritis or colitis, or they would have a very good game plan to prevent those sort of things happening.
This is just fascinating to me, and I'm like stopping myself from asking a question at every sentence that you make. It's just absolutely amazing. It just does sound like an overwhelming amount of things to look at and maybe address. Do you feel that?
That's why I start sort of linearly with it in the book. Because it was basically accumulation of everything I've observed since I was a medical student. But trying to understand it, like, it seemed like the bottom line was that all the patients seemed to have some common element, and what was it? And I guess because I had access to these tests, every single one of those tests I can order, I was able to, and patients who were willing to pay for them as well, and I think my patients are very, they're on the page. They understand that something that I solve in them will help thousands of other people. So they have the same altruism and ideologies. They want the truth. Perhaps we have the same. That's what it is. We're all addicted to the truth.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
And is it, for someone who's trying to find out all this, is it a very expensive process to go through? Because I know the people that are listening, a lot of them are. Yeah,
if you had a good reason, the GP could probably do all the blood tests on Medicare.
Okay.
If they balked, it would probably cost you, $300 or $400, not on Medicare.
Well, how much is gene testing?
It depends who's doing it, but it's about $500, $550. But you only have to do it the once.
Okay, yeah.
Because your genes don't change.
Yeah, no.
Well, even that's a moot point as well.
Yeah.
But, and then the hair analyses, $130, $140.
Okay. So it's not too bad, really. I was sort of wondering if it was going to be a lot more than that. I didn't actually know
For
that.
example, it's 400 something.
Okay, yep.
But the information that you get, if correctly interpreted, is can make a huge difference to somebody's life. It can change them.
Well, that's it.
From being happy and in their own care at home as an elderly person to miserable in a nursing home. That difference. And I think it's worth. I think it is worth the money. And most of the patients, and I don't force them to do it, but they're significantly intrigued and curious and preemptive that they do the test.
Do you find people mostly come to you when they are desperate and not knowing where to turn, and or is it?
I think a well-rounded, objective practitioner realizes that patients only come to see you when they've run out of choices.
Yes, that's what I'm thinking.
And if you don't get that, then maybe it's better to be an accountant. So, not that I have anything against accountants, but
I just have so many.
You have to realise that they've run out of choices, and if you don't give them more choices, you actually haven't done their job. And sometimes I've said to them, "Look, if I can't fix you, I will find someone who can."
That's good.
So, Doctor, can you give us like an example of maybe someone who's gone through these tests and made some discoveries, and then how they went about addressing them and the kind of changes that they saw in themselves?
Yeah, it was probably the best example would have been when I first started. I didn't have all the pieces of the puzzle. They were kind of thrown at me by various people. My patients have always tried to educate me. And when I started the story was I was an anaesthetist in public hospital system, and I got a call from the WA College of Remote and Rural Medicine to tell me that all the anaesthetists in Karratha, the GPs that doing anaesthetics were leaving, and would I be able to help them until the new lot of GPs came along. So I said, okay, all right, well, that sounds like an interesting adventure. I'm in for an adventure. So I went up there, and I was thinking like I was just going to be there for 3 months. And they said to me, there isn't enough work for the anaesthetics here. Why can you help us out in the GP clinic? Because all these GPs are left. So I said, all right, okay. I've done 8 years of general medicine. I think I could probably handle some of that. So I did. And then I remember one patient came in. They must have realised that I was probably not as closed-minded as the other guys that were working there. And one of them came in with this study on zinc, this double-blind randomised study, how zinc supplements could improve immunity for patients with recurrent infections. It's not just one of them, there's heaps of them. And I thought, this is actually quite well designed, this study, and their parameters were, objective, and they really did show that, zinc supplementation worked. So I thought, I hadn't heard about this in medical school, but I might just investigate this. So I had this patient, because it's very hot in Karratha, and outdoor labourers would sweat a lot, and sweat is one of the places you lose zinc. And this guy came in because he wanted a medical certificate because he had another sore throat. And I looked through his notes, and he had like 10 in the last 3 months. And I thought, there's something not right here. So I said, look, I wonder whether you might be low in zinc. Why don't we do a blood test for it? And lo and behold, it came back low. So when I gave him the zinc, really, tested it again, it had come up, and he came in for a review, and he said, I feel heaps better, and not only have my sore throat stopped, but I'm sleeping better, my brain is better, and my asthma's better. I thought, that's interesting. And then it turned out that there are actually studies on all of those things as well, that zinc helps with neurotransmitter production, helps with the immune system, it helps with asthma by improving the secretions of the lung, all these sort of things. And so that was the start, and I started doing more blood tests on zinc and doing more and more. Then I had to go at manganese, and then magnesium, and then vitamin C, and then I started to collate what I'd found at the coalface with the studies that had already been done, and they seemed to match. So I'm just looking for, I guess one of the patients wrote me a really nice testimonial. She's a girl who is 6 years old. She was 6 at the time. And I'll read out what she wrote because I think that probably. Here we go. This is from a girl. Actually, lives in Queensland. She used to live in Perth.
Mm-hmm.
I can enlarge it so I can read the thing. Okay, this is what she wrote here. My name is Elle, we'll call her, and I'm 15 years old. My mother took me to see Dr. Tabrizian when I was 7. When I visited him, I had arthritis in my hands and feet and was not able to attend school or play piano, and everything was really sore. I couldn't hold a pen to write, and I could hardly walk. Mum and Dad had to carry me everywhere. When the anti-inflammatories that the hospital gave me didn't work, and Mum didn't want me on weekly chemotherapy, that's methotrexate, I visited Dr. Tabrizian. In approximately 18 months of Dr. Tabrizian treating me, my arthritis was in remission, and all that I had left was a stiffness in my joints in the morning. I have now completed 4th grade piano and have been able to attend school. I think Dr. Tabrizian is the best, and is my arthritis. And that was probably the first time that I was looking at, the nutrients that affect inflammation, the gut bacteria. And that was a very interesting story because we got her really well.
That's good.
Until she went on a camp to Canberra, a school camp, and she ate completely. Her mum's a real health fanatic, and they always ate really well. And, you can't always do that when you're traveling school camp. And her gut went right off after that camp. And it took us months. Her arthritis came back in a major way. And then it was quite poignant because I thought, wow, could what you have eaten had such a big difference on the level of arthritis that was quiescent and controlled? And the answer was yes.
It's fascinating.
And looking at that, I thought, whoa, we've got to look into this a bit more. And that's where, when patients would come in and say, whenever I have gluten, I feel like I've been hit in the back of the head with a baseball bat. Or whenever I have gluten, I feel like I become a very different person, a very unpleasant person. And noticing the correlations between what we would say are pro-inflammatory foods. And that was another interesting thing because very few doctors will ask the patients what triggered it off. Like the nightshades is the first group that I really looked at, as in, wow, why are your fingers so soft, so sore in the morning? And those foods, they were basically from Central and South America, and they were capsicum, tomato, potato, chili, and eggplant, and tobacco actually is also a nightshade.
Yeah.
And my patients sometimes would say, I can't understand why my fingers are so stiff in the morning. So the first thing I would do is give them that list of nightshades and ask them to stop it and see how that goes. Not everybody will respond to a diet like that, but if they do, I tell you what, they're extremely grateful.
Yeah.
I have husband and wife to come and see me, and the husband had some issues. He'd had prostate cancer, which is in the same interleukin category as autoimmune disorders, interestingly enough, in the genetic studies. And I told him to get off the nightshades to see if that helped his back. But his wife came in 2 weeks later and she said, oh, thank you for telling Michael about the nightshades, because I went on that diet and now all the arthritis in my fingers has stopped.
Oh, that's good.
So that simple intervention, that one little thing can make a huge difference to people, apart from the wheat thing, and then there's the sugar thing, and there's the dairy and the casein thing, and then there's the FODMAPs, the wheat, dairy, fructans, the allium family of foods. And I actually have a colleague who's a rheumatologist who puts people on FODMAP diets for their systemic inflammation. It's one of the first things that he does.
Okay. That's interesting.
A FODMAP-free diet, or is that what
FODMAP-free diet, yeah. It's quite difficult to do. Interestingly, spelt isn't on that list, Joe.
Okay.
Spelt and rye aren't considered to be FODMAPs, but wheat is. I think it's far more immunological wheat. Of course, there's a lot more hassle. There's something about the combinations of the amino acids in wheat that cause issues, because they found that gluten would cause leaky gut in all the volunteers that they gave it to for up to 8 hours.
Wow.
Which means that other things that are being digested at that time take advantage of that leaky gut and may cause an immunological reaction.
So it's a temporary thing, the leaky gut.
You got 16 hours to fix it. And that's why, sometimes my patients, they don't believe me, and I say, okay, I want you to try this diet. I want you to have wheat bix for breakfast, biscuits for morning tea, sandwiches for lunch, cake for afternoon tea, and pasta for dinner. And you call me when you've had enough of that diet. Very few people make a week.
Yeah.
Very few people make it a week. And
that's a mean diet.
It's mean, yeah. Teaching them a lesson.
Your diet.
So, go ahead.
A quick one. So I'm really interested in your take around like a healthy individual and their ability to take in things like nightshades and gluten and casein. Do you believe that there's something inherently bad about these foods, or is it where we are?
To find out who's at risk. I have a feeling it's certain people of European descent, because those foods were brought to Europe from Central and South America. And some people seem to take to them naturally, like the Italians. But there are other people, I think, like from Nordic and Celtic, that don't do so well with those. They seem to react immunologically.
What about gluten and casein?
They're different. They're different reactions. I mean, there are definitely some people who genetically are going to react to wheat. You can do gene studies to show that but there's a lot more people who react to wheat who don't have the gene.
Yeah.
And then you have to break it down as in, what is it? What was the reaction? There's a couple of things. One is that wheat, everyone can handle leaky gut. If you actually do, there's a thing called intestinal permeability studies, and you can do them when somebody's fasting and get a baseline reading. And as soon as you start eating, you actually get leaky gut.
Wow.
It's necessary to absorb the amino acids so that you don't waste energy transporting them into the cell, across the cell, and back out the other side of the cell. So that there is a certain intestinal permeability that's physiological, that's supposed to be there.
Okay.
But the problem with wheat is that it delays the natural closing up of that. Now, if you digest your food properly, if you completely convert a protein to an amino acid, and that's like a bit like a train, like you've got an engine, you've got a tender, and you've got carriages, and then coal cars and flat cars and box cars and oil cars and a caboose. That's a protein. And the idea of the digestive tract is to unlink every carriage and just transport the carriages across. So if you've done that, by the time it gets to the leaky part, no harm done, no foul, because amino acids are inert. You can inject them intravenously. That's what we used to do as anaesthetists. If you're really sick in ICU, used to stick a drip under the collarbone and put amino acids and fats and sugars into a drip and run it, albeit slowly, but you can inject amino acids. And that's what the immune system does, I suppose, is convert something foreign to something self. But if you haven't quite finished that job and you have, say, a caboose and a carriage together, or a coal car and a flat car, and that gets through the immune system, the autism literature, which comes back to this, actually shows that certain combinations, coal car, flat car, caboose, carriage, can set off an anaphylactic shock. Now, that's pretty scary. An anaphylactic shock from 2 amino acids.
Wow.
So there's a spectrum then from, like somebody says, oh, I had that food and I came out in a rash. I had too many prawns and I came out in a rash the next day. Or I had a kiwi fruit and my mouth went all furry and my tongue swollen up. So the grey zone in the middle, most people might ignore. So the gluten opens them up to the problem, but there's something else that causes the problem. Wow. There's a combination of things. That's why sometimes it takes a while for them to figure it out. I can't work out what it is. And it may be the combination. Yeah.
So if you feel like bread, just eat the bread with nothing else and then you'll be okay.
No, some people would take that completely for granted. But I'll tell you what, the word gluten comes from the word agglutinate. And if you think about it, if you take, durum wheat pasta and boil it in a pot for 30 minutes, that's 100 degrees C. You couldn't even put your finger in there for a few seconds without damaging yourself. And yet we want our digestive tract to digest that same thing that could hold under that extreme conditions, or a free loaf bread at 200 degrees C that can hold its shape at 200 degrees C. We expect our digestive tract to eat that. So it's not a given that people can digest those things. They're difficult. They're really troublesome. And the thing with the casein, they're not quite as troublesome in terms of I suppose they do hold like cheese together when you start to create hardened cheeses. But the thing about the caseins, you often find a cross reaction. If somebody's reacting to wheat, they've got anti-casein antibodies as well, which we can't do here in Australia, by the way. But it's to do perhaps with the type of casein. There is a theory that when we had cows as pets, Clarabelle, someone would go and milk that little cow out the back and would drink the milk straight away, unpasteurized. It's probably going, if there are black helicopters flying overhead, it's because I said unpasteurized milk. By the way.
Danger. Someone's preaching raw milk.
Danger, Will Robinson. Danger. This is unpasteurized milk. So they were little cows. And then at some point we said, stuff this, we're going to abrogate the responsibility for our food chain to somebody else. Bad move. And we're going to get dairies to do it. And they said, right, we're not going to waste our time on little cows. We're going to have big ones, because if somebody's going to milk that, we might as well just do, 100 big cows rather than 400 little cows. Dinner's ready, by the way.
Oh, good. What are we having?
That's actually a question I want to ask you.
I'm doing chili tofu stir fry because I'm a veggie. Anyway, so then when we went to the big cows, they're a different group altogether, and this is where the caseins are different. The little cows had A2 casein, and their body weight matched our weights better, especially if you're American. No, sorry, no one is from the US. Delete that one. Okay,
delete that one. Yeah.
Anyway, so the A1 casein cows, that's when people started to react, especially when you pasteurize the milk, because you don't have the enzymes to actually digest the casein. When you pasteurize, you kill off the phosphatases, which you need to digest the calcium, and a whole lot of other things. Don't get me started on that. So, so to change the food chain, the types of cows that we chose started to create a problem elsewhere as a result of that. So, and then, if you think about it, a whole gross national product is based on things like wheat and dairy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not as bad as New Zealand. Well, not as intense as New Zealand. So, and that seemed to be fine for a while. And then something else happened. And I think it was maybe the fact that we stopped growing things organically. When you think about it, in a post-war superphosphate fertilizers, that sort of thing started. People not growing their own produce, the reduction in the diversity of the produce. Like 100 years ago, we had something like 100 species of apple available to us.
Wow.
And now we've got 5 or 6. Something seriously happened. And potatoes, like if you go to other countries, they go, oh, can I have some potatoes? They go, which of the 20 types of potatoes do you want? Or which of the 200 bananas we've got here?
Yeah.
And here we've got like 5, 6. They're inventing new ones all the time. But so the reduction in the biodiversity of the produce, that's got something to do with it. And then the next thing was most bread, well, if you go back in time to, Sumerian times, what they call bread was sprouted grains. And if we'd taken a loaf of bread back, they would have said, oh, that's a sponge, isn't it? That's not bread loaf. But so at one point it was grains like spelt and wheat and rye and oats. And then somebody said, well, wait a second, they're really quite expensive to make. Wheat is much cheaper. Well, why don't we do that? The problem with doing that is you have to invent a whole new method to deal with that, because then your whole raison d'etre is to make a loaf that has the maximum amount of water, because water is a lot cheaper than flour. And that created a system of bread making called the Chorleywood bread making, which is a lot of work that goes into bread to you get the maximum out of the wheat that you're using. So as you degrade the types of grains that you've got, you create a problem somewhere else. You've got to use more yeast then, etc. Yeah. So the produce has changed, and if you went back 200 years, we took a glass of milk from today and went back 200 years and compared it to one of theirs, they would laugh. It wouldn't look the same. It's certainly not white. So yeah, it's the type of produce too, I think, that's created it. And maybe also the fact that, we don't make food from scratch anymore.
Yeah.
That, the processed foods, when you have fast foods, they have an agenda. They want to get you addicted on it. So they've got, the sugar and the salt side of thing going on. And the fact that we are having more processed foods, and then we've got to have shelf life. So then somebody said, we have preservatives in them now. So there's this is why people buy these machines, the Thermomix machines, because they cut out all that junk in the middle. It goes straight from the ingredient with no middleman, no processing to their own, better quality food.
Yeah.
Do you have any views on things like lifestyle things, like say sun exposure, movement, and sleep, for instance? Is that something that you consider with your patients?
I think they're all an issue. We've become more sedentary and more addicted to screens. I have to say that's going to bite us in the bum later on.
Yeah.
And to create a generation of delinquents, I think. But yeah, exercise is another thing that everything, our cities, the way that created is all around transport and less on exercise. We now have to go to gyms to exercise. But there was a very interesting study about longevity and exercise. I can't remember who did it, but they were looking at the people who lived the longest and how exercise played a part. And the people who lived the longest were those where exercise was a part of their daily life. So they had to walk down to the well, fill up the bucket, bring it back, till the fields, this kind of thing. And the people who went to the gym for exercise had no improvement in longevity whatsoever, even though they consider them to be healthy. I think that's activities of daily living, the exercise, planning it in our daily life, and you probably read that study about, every hour you sit, you lose a year of life or something. Sitting is one of the worst things. Screens turn off your proprioceptive muscles of your spine, so we've got more back problems, more neck problems because of screens. They affect sleep patterns. Coming back to sleep, 40% of Australians have a sleep disorder.
Yeah, wow.
I mean, some people blame light toxicity, and it's because we don't synchronize ourselves with the sun moon anymore. Our circadian rhythms are out. As soon as it gets dark, we turn on a light. And we stay out looking at screens. And the problem with that is it fools the pineal gland, because when you want to go into a sleep cycle, the retina is monitoring the ambient light levels. It's a bit like those old meters that used to have for photography, the lux. And as it starts to drop, a certain set of nerves just above the eyeballs at the back send a message to the pineal gland to say, hey, the light levels are dropping. We might be going into a night cycle, so better get the other guys together. But the screens stop that. They're so bright.
What about having the sunlight as well during the day come into your eye? Like most of us don't have that at all.
No.
Like even the sun on our skin.
We've got this solar phobia. Oh my God, the sun's out. How will I get to the car?
What do you think of that? I'd really like to take your opinion on it. Like I come from a Middle Eastern Mediterranean country. I'm aware that the ozone layer here is slightly different to where I'm from. But I never grew up in this kind of culture where they put on sunscreen as much. And I'm not really sure where I stand with regards to...
It's famous for cedar trees?
Yes, it is. Yeah. I am from Lebanon, yes.
Must be Lebanon, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So you gave yourself away there.
I'm open
the thing
about it.
European sun and Mediterranean sun is very different. I remember seeing pictures of people like in Umbria, and they're out there without their hats on, and none of them seem to get burnt. And it's to do with the ozone layer and the UVB UVA ratio and the latitude and all these kind of things. Perth has a latitude of 32 degrees. I'm not sure about where you guys live, but it's closer to the equator, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, Fouad's in Sydney, but I'm in
vitamin D. I think that's probably a good thing. The thing that they found with vitamin D was that you only really make vitamin D when you have UVB ratio around 50% to UVA, which is when the sun is in the zenith, directly overhead. And And that has to be, so that's the middle of the day. That's when your best chance of making vitamin D. And
which
once
is
you
when
start
everyone
to
tells
tan,
you not to go out.
Absolutely. When you start to tan, you actually reduce the vitamin D production. So it has to be mostly on the torso, out in the courtyard in a bikini kind of thing. And for 15 minutes, that's all you need. You don't need a whole day. But previously, Australians would spend the whole day out in the sun without adequate cover and get burnt, and then do it again the next day and the day after that. So that is that's going to create a very different problem.
Sure.
You're going to have people with really good levels of vitamin D, but you're going to create more people with solar radiation issues down the track. And plus the slip, slop, slap thing that we did, we became, paranoid about solar radiation, to the point where now we're seeing all these people with low levels of vitamin D, really, really low. Now, that isn't the end of the story, because the lowest levels of vitamin D you'll see in dark-skinned people, like I have Sri Lankan patients, Indigenous patients, they're all rock bottom. But the interesting thing is that when you do the gene studies, you find out that there's a different sensitivity to vitamin D in different people. About 40% of the population, their vitamin D receptors are deaf. So even if you've got lots of vitamin D in the bloodstream, they don't seem to work. And this is what the gene studies showed me, that this is called the VDR, vitamin D receptor genes. I think there's 3 or 4. So the dark-skinned people, their receptors are very good listeners. So they can run on very low levels of vitamin D because the receptors listen to vitamin D. And then there's this other group of people who have adequate levels of D, but their vitamin D receptors are deaf. They appear like they're deficient, even though the level isn't. It's called functional vitamin D deficiency. So it's a complicated thing that we've done. Australians, the bronze Australian kind of persona that used to be out there, and we've now gone to the goth kind of. I think we've gone a bit too far with that.
Yeah.
It sounds like we've gotten to a place that is so difficult to navigate for most of us that, but what do you feel like the hope for the future is around this area? Are we going to be able to get out of this, or is this knowledge going to be only known by a select few who are really interested in researching, and the rest of people are going to suffer? Or do you feel there's a change happening?
It really is a minefield, because you can't believe everything that you read.
That's right.
I mean, as I said, I was a devout skeptic, so I have to read something and convince myself 3 times before I believe it. Were you specifically meaning about vitamin D, or all of the issues?
All the things that you brought up. It seems like, for instance, I'd need to see someone like you to be able to get myself back on track, or and I don't even have many serious problems in my life, but it's something that I'm interested in continuously improving myself. But people who do have problems will find that they need...
All of these tests are available to anyone in this country, in fact, even outside this country. And that's what I tried to put in my book, to say, look, find a GP who will listen to you. And if they're not on the same page, find somebody else. I mean, that's how, shop with your feet. The consumer has all the power in this country, all the power, even though they feel they're being emasculated by the multinationals. So find someone who's a listener. Not all the GPs will do things like, genetic tests and hair samples, but all the naturopaths, almost all of them, will. So they can do gene tests. They can you can get the doctor, ask politely to do the tests, ask politely to have the results of the tests, show them to the naturopaths who do these gene studies, who will often do a hair analysis, and they will put that together and come up with a game plan. They're actually very good at this. They're heaps better at it than medical doctors, because they don't have to unlearn anything first.
Yeah.
Wow.
So if you can just do a quick wrap up of your book. So where can people find that, and what's it called?
It's called Inflammation, the Disease We All Have. And when you read the list of itises, you'll see that everyone has some inflammation. Yeah. It's a ubiquitous thing, although we don't necessarily think of it as painful. So it's on Amazon as an ebook. And that, as I said, that has some advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage is that it's not in a book you can, sit on the toilet and read. but lots of people take their iPads.
Yeah, that's true.
Any of these smartphones can read an ebook. A computer, any laptop, desktop can read an ebook. The tablets, the Surface.
Pretty much the device that people are listening on this podcast.
Yeah, it is. I was so it's available ebook. If you look at I don't know if they have a special section on Amazon, but if you put Dr. Tabrizian inflammation ebook, you'll probably find it.
That's right. I can put a link on the Wellness Couch website as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think what I'd like to do is to get this information out to people so they can start stirring the pot, because
and that's what we've got to do.
But as a group you can, and then perhaps it'll be have one patient after another coming and asking for these tests. The GPs will realise that perhaps it's actually an important thing to understand why people get sick, and we shouldn't just pat them on the head and say we don't know something, because that's not actually true.
I have to say, when I first started going to my GP, who's a friend of mine and she's absolutely lovely, when I first started taking my son to her for his OCD problems, the idea of changing his diet was totally foreign to her, and if I mentioned it, she would quickly change the subject. And after 6 months of me working really hard on healing his gut, I took him back in, and the difference was major. And she got a student doctor in and said, you need to hear about this diet. So it really does, it can change their minds when they see that it's working.
It is a shame that we have to push it, though. It's you would really want your healthcare provider to be the person who, is doing that. Do you see any movement in that area, Dr. T?
Be au fait with the terminology that your patients are using. And if they're talking about gluten-free, nightshades, dysbiosis, and that, be a bit more savvy about their terminology.
Are you seeing any change in the area or the culture within the medical community?
Definitely.
Okay.
It's having, I suppose, gone through what I did go through with no apparent answers at the time, and then, discovering things by my own from a skeptic's point of view, I realised that the only way to change things is conquest by subversion. And that is that words are more powerful than bullets.
Yeah.
Although there are some people who disagree. I think the Americans, for instance. But,
he's got a thing about the Americans.
But words are more powerful than bullets. And so what I did was I thought, if you wanted to make it change, the way to do it is to do it through you're not going to do it through the medical profession.
Words and bullets, Dr. T. I think put them together.
So the best thing is to empower your patients, and then they tell someone else, who then finds your information, who then tells someone else. So it's like multiple ripples in a pond, and eventually the whole pond's sort of jumping, and that's the way I looked at this, is to information is more powerful in that sense. So that's why I wrote my books and trying to change the world.
That's good.
From my desk.
Well, that's good. You're doing a good job, because I keep hearing about your books. So I have to I really need to read that information when I still haven't got to it. But we should probably finish up, because it's an hour or so that we've been chatting.
We have, yes.
And you need to go eat your dinner.
I haven't cooked it yet.
Oh, you haven't cooked it yet. Okay. You need to go cook your dinner. So thank you so much for all that. And we'll probably think of a zillion more questions to ask you, won't we, Fouad?
Yeah, I would love to have you back on the show.
Bad cop thing, don't you?
No, we can think of heaps more things to pick your brains on.
Oh my God, the amount of questions I have in my head now.
I know, because that was a lot. That was a lot of information.
But everything is connected to everything, Joe.
Yeah.
Like, I know when I was looking, because I had some time in the country. I was a weighbridge officer, so I used to get to talk to the farmers. Mm-hmm. And I realised that, veterinary science is akin to, similar to, medical science, and veterinary science is, akin to farming, and farming is, related to soil science, and soil science is related to chemistry, and chemistry is related to biochemistry, and biochemistry is related to medicine, and then medicine is related to veterinary science, and the whole thing, it's no information just should flow from any of those freely, but it doesn't.
The problem in our society now, you mentioned the word holistic, and everyone starts rolling their eyes because...
no, even I roll my eyes. I am rolling my eyes. We were doing a video conference. Yeah, and that's a really painted word, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it.
There's so many words that have been changed over the years that have different connotations.
But you're right, it's all connected.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Dr. T, really amazing. I love this podcast. I'm really, really happy to have had you on the show. And I'm very excited to have you again if you would come again and have another quirky chat with us.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground. I mean, there's probably some things you want to have maybe more.
Dig deeper into.
I think it's important to understand how farming practice and horticulture has changed health as well.
That's a good point, yeah.
Because a lot of my patients are farmers and horticulturists or scientists in that area, and they tell me stuff. I'm just horrified.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the amount of pesticides and just that alone, what it does to the soil, and then what it does to our guts, and they're actually breeding bacteria that is resistant to these pesticides now, and we won't be able to grow the food. I mean, that's going to be a big problem.
The book that I recommend on this subject is The Omnivore's Dilemma. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Okay. Yeah. Michael Pollan. It's beautiful.
Yeah. He nailed that whole thing really quite well. And he was the poignant line in there was that cattle farmers should be grass farmers. And biodiversity is sustainable, but monoculture is not.
Yeah, we're already seeing the world deserts forming because of these monoculture practices, and it's just amazing. I think one really cool thing, if you're interested in that side of things as well, there's Alan Savory. He has a really great talk around using cattle to bring back desert land and turn it into agricultural
land. I heard about that, yeah.
And it's just when you start using nature the way that it is intended to be used, and then you see it will heal itself. And we are part of nature, so if we go back to those kinds of practices, then we should expect ourselves to heal, hopefully before we're too far gone.
There is a farm up here that I've been to on a organic food tour that does all that kind of thing with the cattle. It's so fascinating. I was amazed just listening to them talk about it all. But it's not very well known.
No.
I guess everyone thinks, can I make money out of this?
Yeah, exactly. and quickly.
That's the bottom line, and cost consultants in farming are often fertilizer company employees, and they don't necessarily give the information that's best for the environment.
We're getting on to another subject now.
Yeah.
But it's all connected.
It is.
What they do there affects us here.
Yeah.
And probably the person that stands out the most is a guy called Dr. Albrecht. I think he's from Missouri in America. And he said that if you get these base cations right, sodium, potassium, calcium, and magnesium, if you get those four things right and in balance, your population will be healthier. And that created a system of soil analysis called the Albrecht method. I don't know if you've come across that. But it saves water, improves output just by doing those four things. But some farmers will do it. You're probably the ones that you meet. If you mention the Albrecht method of soil analysis, they go, we use that.
Yeah. We'll have to get into that on another podcast, won't we?
Yes, we will. Maybe send them what you want, perhaps some random questions, almost like you did today.
Yes, like we did today.
We might have our listeners ask you a few questions.
Yeah, that might be a good idea.
Yeah.
The infrequently asked questions.
Yes. They're always good.
One of my accents.
Maybe we'll do a show that's just Dr. T, with his hat off and see what happens.
Yeah, that might be cool.
Dr. D was doing the most amazing impersonations before the show started.
Sorry, we didn't include them in the recording.
You never know answer next time you call.
Just got to prepare for it. Let's see how we go.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. Well, thank you so much. We'll let you go, and we'll definitely talk to you again. And if anybody does have some questions for Dr. T, where would it be best for them to write them? I mean, they can just put them onto our Facebook pages if that's easy. You don't have a website or anything?
I don't know.
You don't know? We can just get them to put them on.
I've never had that question asked before. I mean,
most people usually ask on my. I've got a chat group and a Facebook page, and Fouad's got a Facebook page. So if people just ask on there, if you've got a question, and we can collate them all for the next podcast.
Okay, so that's probably a good idea.
Yeah?
If you
or email them, you guys can.
Often, what you find is there'll be similar questions.
Yeah, that's right. We usually find that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We go through them.
What's wrong with wheat? Why does he keep having a go at wheat?
They're used to us having a go at it. Don't worry.
Most of our listeners are wheat free.
Yeah. And don't forget to check out Dr. Igor's book, which is the information book, which I'll put the link to, because that might answer a lot of the questions anyway.
I think it will, and as we've got time to digest them as well, because it works in a sort of, it's sort of on a storyboard. Things like a cartoon, and so it's very linear. Goes from one thing to the next, and some people, you have to approach it that way.
Yep.
And
it's excellent. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Fouad, for helping out there too, and hopefully we'll be back soon.
Yeah, you will.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks everyone.
So much.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
This has been a production of TheWellnessCouch.com. Check us out on Facebook and join in the conversation on Facebook.com/The Wellness Couch. Subscribe to each show on iTunes and check us out on Twitter. The Wellness Couch, streaming wellness into your lives. Whilst the Wellness Couch presenter endeavor to provide accurate and helpful information to their listeners, these podcasts cannot take into account individual circumstances and are not intended to be a substitute for health and medical advice from a qualified health professional. You should always seek the advice of a qualified health professional before acting on any of the information provided by any of the Wellness Couch podcasts.